It was supposed to be a quiet weekend morning. The woods were calm, the leaves damp with dew, and the hunting path lay undisturbed, just as it had for generations. This was private land, a place where family traditions lived on, far away from the constant bickering of the neighborhood HOA. But that calm was shattered by the distant rumble of an engine. At first, the sound didn't register. An engine, here, in the woods. Impossible. Yet, the low growl grew louder until a shiny black SUV appeared at the edge of the trail. The driver? None other than the HOA inspector. The man's vehicle crept arrogantly onto the narrow hunting path, clearly not built for an SUV. Thick tires crushed small branches, spitting dirt as it lurched forward. His windows were rolled down, and with an air of entitlement, he surveyed the woods as though they were his to manage. He leaned out, scanning trees, trails, and even the hunter's small posted signs, acting as though he was on official business. The narrator stood frozen in disbelief. This wasn't just a mistake or a lost driver, this was a deliberate intrusion. The HOA had long been pushing limits, but driving an SUV onto private hunting land crossed into dangerous territory. The path was never meant for vehicles, it was narrow, uneven, and sacred to those who walked it. With every turn of the SUV's wheels, frustration boiled. The deep grooves in the soil felt like scars, and the crunch of branches sounded like insults. The inspector didn't belong here, and yet he carried himself like he owned the place. The hunter's blood ran hot as he realized the inspector wasn't just trespassing, he was sending a message. The HOA thought their power extended anywhere, even beyond their legal boundaries. That morning, watching his sacred ground desecrated, the hunter's patience broke. This wasn't going to be settled with a polite conversation. A line had been crossed, and it was time to make sure the inspector never forgot where the boundary truly lay. The moment the SUV rolled deeper into the trail, the hunter knew he couldn't stay silent. He stepped out from the tree line, boots crunching against the gravelly path, and waved his arm to stop the vehicle. The inspector slowed, clearly annoyed, but finally rolled to a halt just a few feet away. The window slid down, and there he was, the same smug face the hunter had seen countless times at HOA meetings, always quick to remind neighbors of rules, fines, and so-called violations. "What do you think you're doing?" the hunter demanded, his voice steady but charged with anger. "This is private land. This path is not part of the HOA's jurisdiction." The inspector leaned back in his seat, smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Oh, I'm just making sure everything around here is up to code," he replied lazily. His tone dripped with arrogance. The HOA has a right to inspect surrounding areas. Sometimes violations happen outside of fences. You wouldn't want to break the rules, would you? That statement hit like a slap in the face. The hunter's land had nothing to do with the HOA. They didn't own the woods, they didn't maintain the trails, and they had no authority beyond the neatly platted lots they loved to control. Yet here was their inspector, sitting in his SUV like a king patrolling his domain, acting as though he had every right to be there. "You've crossed the line," the hunter snapped. "This is not your territory, and you need to turn around right now." But instead of backing down, the inspector revved the SUV's engine, the growl echoing through the woods. His smirk widened. "You can't tell me where I can or can't go," he said, before rolling the window back up. With a spray of dirt, the SUV lurched forward, heading deeper into the trail. The hunter's fists clenched. Reasoning wasn't going to work with this man. He was too arrogant, too convinced of his authority. Watching the SUV disappear around the bend, the hunter realized one thing: if he wanted to protect his land, he'd have to do more than just argue. It was time to take action. That night, the hunter sat on his porch, staring out into the dark woods. The sound of the inspector's SUV still echoed in his mind, the crunch of tires, the arrogant growl of the engine, the smug look on that man's face. The confrontation had proved one thing: this inspector wouldn't stop. If he could roll into private land once, he'd do it again, and worse, he'd keep pushing until he believed the HOA truly controlled it. The hunter knew words wouldn't change anything. Reason had no place when someone was drunk on authority. No, if the inspector wanted to test boundaries, then he'd have to learn the hard way what happens when you trespass where you don't belong. He went to his shed, flicking on the dim light. Hanging on the wall were tools, ropes, old hunting gear, and a box he hadn't opened in years. Inside were heavy-duty road spikes, designed long ago for protection against vehicles that didn't belong. They were thick, sharp, and capable of shredding tires in seconds. The hunter lifted them carefully, the cold steel glinting under the bulb. His plan was simple: the next time the inspector tried to drive up that trail, he'd be met with a surprise. The hunter carried the spikes out into the woods under cover of night. The moonlight barely touched the ground as he reached the narrowest bend of the hunting path. There, he knelt down and began arranging the spikes across the dirt, camouflaging them with leaves, twigs, and a thin layer of soil. From a distance, the ground looked untouched. Up close, it was a trap waiting to spring. As he worked, his heart pounded, not with fear, but with anticipation. He wasn't out to harm the inspector, only to send a message. A blown tire or two would be enough to humble the arrogant man, enough to show him this land wasn't a playground for his power trips. When the last spike was hidden, the hunter stood and looked down at his handiwork. The path was ready. The inspector thought he was untouchable. Tomorrow, he would learn that some land fights back. The following morning, the woods were alive with the sound of birds, but the hunter's ears were tuned for something else. He didn't have to wait long. The low growl of an engine drifted through the trees. The inspector was back, just as expected. The hunter crouched behind a thick oak, watching with narrowed eyes as the shiny SUV crept arrogantly onto the hunting path again. The inspector looked confident, almost smug, as if daring the land itself to challenge him. He leaned one arm out of the window, sunglasses reflecting the morning sun, and pushed the vehicle forward without hesitation. Each spin of the tires dug deeper ruts into the earth, his disrespect carved into the soil itself. Then it happened. Bang! The front tire exploded with a deafening crack. The SUV lurched violently, the front end dipping into the dirt. The inspector slammed the brakes, but it was too late. Crunch. The second front tire shredded instantly. The vehicle screeched to a crooked stop, hissing and groaning as the rubber collapsed under the steel teeth hidden beneath the soil. The inspector stumbled out of the SUV, his face twisted with disbelief. He looked down at the ruined tires, then at the ground, kicking at the leaves until the gleam of the spikes revealed themselves. His jaw dropped. No way, he muttered, circling the damage. The hunter could almost taste the man's humiliation from where he hid. The once cocky inspector, always so quick to bark about rules and regulations, now stood powerless, stranded on a trail he had no business being on. His expensive SUV sat crippled, tilted awkwardly as the rims dug into the dirt. The silence of the forest returned, broken only by the inspector's muttered curses. His pride had deflated faster than his tires. The hunter finally stepped out from behind the trees, calm and steady, arms crossed over his chest. Their eyes met, and for the first time, the inspector didn't look superior, he looked small. "This path doesn't belong to your HOA, the hunter said firmly. "And now you know what happens when you cross into land that isn't yours." The inspector's smirk was gone. Replaced instead by the bitter taste of defeat, the inspector stood frozen for a moment, staring at his ruined SUV as if his authority alone might magically repair it. But the sharp hiss of air leaking from the shredded tires was undeniable. The woods, once echoing with the roar of his engine, had grown still, so quiet that even his shallow breathing sounded loud. For the first time, the man looked uncertain, stripped of the smug confidence he always carried into HOA meetings and neighborhood inspections. The hunter walked closer, slow and deliberate, boots crunching on gravel. He stopped a few feet away, arms folded, his expression calm but unyielding. The inspector's eyes darted nervously, as if calculating whether to argue or retreat. "You thought this land belonged to you," the hunter said, his voice steady, almost cold. "But this is private property. It's not part of your maps, your rules, or your HOA. You don't own everything, and today you learned that." The inspector opened his mouth, but no words came out. His usual arsenal of regulations and fine print meant nothing here. Out in the woods, surrounded by trees and silence, the HOA's power was useless. All he had was a crippled vehicle and the realization that he had crossed into a place he didn't belong. Finally, with his pride shattered, he muttered something under his breath and began the long, humiliating walk back toward the neighborhood. Each step was heavy, his shoes crunching against the dirt path he once treated like his own. The hunter didn't move, didn't gloat, he simply watched, making sure the man carried the weight of the lesson with every stride. The SUV sat abandoned, a symbol of arrogance undone. Eventually, the inspector would have to return with a tow truck, and the story would spread, how the mighty HOA inspector had been stopped dead in his tracks by the very land he tried to dominate. From that day forward, the hunting path remained untouched. No SUV ever dared roll its tires down the trail again. And whenever the hunter walked that path, he felt a quiet satisfaction. Not from revenge, but from knowing he had drawn a line no one would ever cross again. Some boundaries, after all, are meant to stay untouched.